Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Chair. It's my great pleasure to move these final 3 amendments to try and strengthen these new water protections against coal seam gas and coal mining. The first amendment goes to the application of these new protections. And whilst the Greens are thrilled that almost 2 years after we moved similar legislation to protect aquifers, the government has finally now done so themselves, we're concerned that in the interim all of the big projects have already been approved. Sadly, we know that Minister Burke has not rejected a single coal seam gas or coal mine application that's crossed his desk. And I was particularly disappointed that only several days after approving Gloucester coal seam gas and 3 big coal mines in New South Wales, Maules Creek, Boggabri and Tarrawonga, suddenly the minister announced that yes, he would now belatedly move to protect aquifers with this new water trigger bill. So this first amendment goes to the fact that those 4 projects should in fact be subjected to these new water powers. Those big companies should now have to look at the impacts of water, and the Federal Environment Minister should be obliged to ensure that water impacts are able to be managed, and if there's any uncertainty, the minister should have the ability to actually reject those projects. As I say, given that work has not already commenced, we think that this is a sensible and safe approach. The other effect of this retrospectivity amendment goes to those earlier approved Queensland coal seam gas projects. Within several months of becoming the Environment Minister, Minister Burke ticked off on the first 2 big coal seam gas projects, and several months thereafter the 3rd big coal seam gas project. Now, given that the 4th one is still yet to be approved, we need the benefit of the information about the water impacts of those first big 3 before the decision on the final 4th one gets made. So this amendment wouldn't change the approval status of those big 3, given that it was unfortunately granted many years ago and work has commenced, but it would ensure that water studies have to be done so that we know what damage is already being done and how much risk those aquifers are already facing before the minister decides whether or not to approve the 4th project, being Arrow coal seam gas. So that's the genesis of those amendments. The second tranche of amendments go to the protection that the Greens think the federal government should keep for nationally important environmental assets. Now, we've seen in the House that this bill was amended to make sure that this new water power can't be given away to state governments, and we absolutely support that. In fact, we were behind that amendment getting up. But what we've now seen is an admittance, a concession, that the state governments don't always do the best job in looking after the environment. If there's that acknowledgement that water is too precious to be trusted solely to the states and that we need federal oversight, then we think it's only fair that World Heritage of international significance receive that same protection. And likewise, all of those other elements that are currently protected by the EPBC Act, threatened species, Ramsar wetlands, migratory species, the Great Barrier Reef, national heritage areas, we think those things are of national importance. And I think it's a craven shame that whilst we originally saw the Labor government protecting these areas 30 years ago through intervening in the Franklin Dam, that it was this same very Labor government that was proposing giving away those federal veto powers down to state governments. Now, just to set the record straight, because there's been quite a lot of confusion and rhetoric promulgated by the Business Council and its ilk, we have 2 stages of environmental assessment. Of environmental approvals, assessment and approvals. We have already accredited, the Commonwealth has already accredited the state's assessment processes, so any duplication that might have existed has already been dealt with and put to bed. There is now no duplication. There is simply the need for the Commonwealth to also issue an approval or a refusal decision. As we know, it's generally an approval decision that gets made, but nonetheless we still need that important veto power. So it is simply ridiculous to contend that there is duplication going on, which is why it is so crucial that the Commonwealth retain that final power to say no to things like mines in World Heritage areas, or to say no to clearing the last vestige of a threatened species habitat that would send a species to extinction. People need to know that the national environment deserves national protection, and that's certainly what all of the polls on these issues are telling us. People want the federal government to be able to protect the environment, not a bizarre concept and one that's got majority support. So this amendment would delete those parts of the Act that allow those powers, those final protection approval powers, to be simply given away to state governments. So this amendment would stop Tony Abbott's coalition, Mr Tony Abbott's coalition, who have committed to using these powers to hand off federal environmental approval powers. It would stop them from doing so unless, of course, they get control of both houses of parliament and change the laws again, and that's, of course, in the hands of the people. So the point of this amendment is to make sure that it's not Campbell Newman that's solely in control of Queensland's environment. It's not Barry O'Farrell that's solely in control of New South Wales' environment, nor any of the other state premiers that have sole control over national parts of our environment that are often internationally significant. We need that final veto power of the federal government against state governments who have a history of approving development even though it would damage the environment. The final amendment, Chair, goes to protecting our national parks. And it's along a similar theme. Unfortunately, we've seen state governments in recent months approving shooting in national parks. Never mind the safety concerns of families wanting to walk in those parks who might actually not want to be shot. Who would have thought they'd rather have a picnic than be dodging bullets? We've also seen grazing approved, of course, originally in Victoria in the Alpine area, which was then overturned, and now in Queensland. We've also seen we've had shooting, we've had grazing, we've also seen logging now approved by the Queensland government, and of course prospecting just approved by the Victorian state government, and now plans to sell off Victoria's national parks. So I'm afraid national parks are under threat from the reckless actions of state governments, and when we've got less than 4% of the country covered by national parks, why on earth can't it be off limits to logging, to mining, to grazing, to shooting? Why can't we just protect those areas and properly manage them? It doesn't seem unreasonable to me. So this amendment would actually deliver on Minister Burke's commitment of almost 2 years ago that sadly has gone nowhere. Minister Burke originally said he would step in and protect national parks if state governments continued on their destructive agenda. They've done so. They've gotten worse, and still they haven't acted. So this amendment clearly says national parks should be given national protection, and we urge both sides of the chamber to support it. The Federal Environment Minister has missed the deadline to act to protect national parks by regulation. If he does so move, and still we'd encourage him to do so, but we'd rather he support this amendment here and now, which will deliver lasting protection for national parks. If the minister simply moves to add national parks as a trigger to these laws by regulation, we know those regulations are susceptible to disallowance, and we can expect that the opposition in government, if they gain that honour, will in fact disallow them. The only way to guarantee protection for national parks is to support this amendment. So it's with great pleasure that I commend these amendments to the chamber.